Good afternoon. I'm David Chalmers and I'm the chair of North Devon Sunrise, who are the hosts of Northern Devon's annual Diversity Festival. And this year, instead of our usual Saturday afternoon in Barnstable, we are bringing you a series of events over the whole of this week relating to diversity. And this afternoon, I'm really delighted to say that we have an old friend of ours for Northern Devon, and that is Helen Belcher. And Helen, as many of you recall, came down last year for LGBT History Month, and we had gave presentations at Petrock, at the Barnstable and Tiverton campuses, and so knows our area well. But I just want to say before we kick off that Sunrise is applying at the moment for its charitable status, which is, and we're hoping any day at the moment to hear about that, which is going to be very exciting. But we are run, as you know, as an organisation, many volunteers, and all this is sort of brought to you at our expense. And so if any of you would like to give a donation, we have at the bottom of our Facebook page, our website, Twitter, all of those, a link through to the Aviva Community Fund. And that any donation, large or small, 100% of it comes directly to us and helps us with our work in the community here in Northern Devon, celebrating diversity, which we're doing today, but challenging discrimination and also changing attitudes. So this is, as I said, it's a real delight. We've got an old friend of ours here, Helen Belcher, this afternoon, and I'd just like to say welcome, Helen.
Thank you, David. Real pleasure to be here. Slightly less of the old, please.
Well, yeah, I'm one to talk. Kicking off, since when you were down here last year, the big thing that has sort of happened for us is, well, those of us involved in politics, the general election of last year. And I know that you stood in Chippenham and had a great result. Could you just tell us a little bit about that? Because I know when you came down, you were talking about it, you were preparing for it.
I mean, you say a great result. The best result would have been to win. But, well, you know, no prizes in our system for second place, sadly. But yeah, I mean, we did well. We put on almost 9% on our vote share. Clearly now, the challengers, we squeak in. If people who study elections say that there's, if you get less than a 20% gap between the winner and the second place, then that's an interesting seat to watch. And we've just squeezed in under that. So we're 19 point something % away, which still seems quite a lot. But we had an awful lot of volunteers come and help this time, far more than last time. We had many more people that we knocked on doors with. I think we talked about 7,000 or 8,000 people over the course of the general election campaign, as much as everyone else that we'd managed to talk to before. So yeah, I mean, we sort of got almost 20,000 votes this time. So
yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, and for those of you into politics, all the constituencies were kind of grouped into Remain seats or Leave seats, and the Lib Dem campaign was very much focused on winning Remain vote. And Chippenham, even though I kind of disagree with the analysis slightly, but Chippenham was classed as a Leave seat. And so we ended up getting the best result for the highest performing Lib Dem seats out of all the Leave seats in the country. So that was quite something as well.
And you weren't the only trans candidate, were you, in the election?
No, there were a handful because of the politics and sort of the media coverage over the preceding year. I think very many people who are trans were either dissuaded for standing this time or didn't want to make their trans status known, particularly.
Right. Okay.
So I think the numbers look as though they were down on last year, but yes, I wasn't the only one. But I did, out of all the ones who declared themselves to be trans, I'm still the one who got the highest number of votes and the highest percentage of votes. So
yeah, no, I mean, well then, because I said that you were the most likely person to become our first trans member of Parliament, and then that was right, and it still holds true today. So I was on a call the other day with the Taiwanese minister of digital minister. It's a trans, and it's the first trans member of their cabinet, and it's interesting that is. Do you see things changing around the world, or is it still very just the odd?
Things are changing around the world generally.
Yeah.
I think as people sort of slowly get used to the fact that there are trans people there, and that actually we don't just bang on about trans things, then it's and seen as useful members and valuable members of society in our own right. Then those barriers and inhibitions start coming down. And so in most of the world, I would say things are getting better for trans people. There are a few places where it isn't. So it's America at the moment, the United States, is a real problem with Trump rolling back all sorts of protections and rights. You've got Orban in Hungary. The first thing that Orban did with his emergency powers under the COVID regulations was to prohibit the great evil of gender recognition. All the things that he could have done to make everybody's lives in Hungary better, the first thing he does is pick a fight with trans people. And you're starting to see that in other places in Europe as well. Eastern Europe. So Poland, there's LGBT issues have been quite major in the presidential election, although I noticed that Duda is starting to try and roll back the rhetoric, having realised how quickly it catches. Romania also, they've just passed a sort of trans section 28, so prohibiting talk of gender identity in educational establishments. So so there are worrying signs as well. And in France, interesting, I mean, there's a sort of march of the right in some areas, and they're sort of getting coordinated around LGBT issues. And so, but it has different manifestations in different places. So in France, it's manifesting itself around access to sex and relationships education, which is a battle I think we've won here, although not, there's some noises at the moment about that as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I'm coming to us here in the UK. It feels at the moment, I mean, I've heard this from people, that there's almost an attempt being made to try and sort of like make a division between us in our community. So for years, we've actually been coming together, gay men supporting lesbians, supporting the trans community. And it's are you noticing this at all?
I've noticed the attempts, but what's been interesting over the past few months is how robust and resilient LGBT communities are to those attempts to try and create a division.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a group which is set up, which is, trying to protect the right of LGBT people against us awful trans people. And actually, it's largely populated by people who aren't LGBT, and it's largely populated, it's got a lot of funding, which appears quite mysterious. But what that's doing is it's actually uniting all the other LGBT organisations. One of my roles, I'm the chair of an organisation called Consortium. And so we work with around about 350 to 400 other LGBT organisations in the country to try and make sure that they're governed well, that the trustees know how to run an organisation, a charity and whatever, but also that we're all kind of able to cooperate, and so people can share resources, share knowledge, but also pull in the same sort of direction. And it has been really interesting how unified the organisations that we see, all the way up from organisations like Stonewall and LGBT Foundation, which are like the biggest ones in the country, all the way down to little grassroots support organisations, are very, very united at the moment. I've not seen that before.
Oh, good. I mean, how we saw reports last week, that the government, this Conservative government, is preparing to backtrack on some of its the commitments it made towards trans people. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it was a couple of weekends, 2 or 3 weekends ago. It was a headline in the Sunday Times on the front page. I mean, government is sort of being very coy about what it's doing. So it's not really clear yet what government is proposing to do. We're being told it should we should know within 2 or 3 weeks before Parliament goes on holiday. But the indications are quite alarming.
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, I mean, if you think about it, we started in 2015, there was a parliamentary inquiry into trans lives. And amongst many things, including things like access to healthcare and education about trans lives, one of the things that was picked out was the Gender Recognition Act and the process through which people go through to recognise their gender legally. And how bureaucratic and costly and cumbersome people found it. And so one of the things that was highlighted was perhaps we could streamline that process. And what we've seen over 3 years is a real twisting of that agenda to, you know, try and pull trans people or trans women in particular out from women-only spaces.
Yeah.
And so when this government, which I could be very political, but I'll try very hard to moderate my language. But when this government looks at what it sees the debate happening, then it's kind of getting, well, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe, you know, maybe we should start to think about access to women's safe spaces. So, but it's difficult because it's a leak. We've not heard anything in detail from government about what they're proposing to actually do. And this is in result of a consultation which was announced in 2017, didn't happen for a year, whilst the media narrative around this got going and very confused. We had 3 months in consultation in the autumn of 2018, and 20 odd months later, we're still waiting for the results. We know that over 100,000 people responded to it. The leak tells us that a majority of people were in favour of reform. But government is now thinking about ignoring that consultation. So that creates a level of difficulty as well. And part of the problem, I probably should let you come in, Dave, with another question, but part of the problem is that the whole debate has become quite philosophical about what it means to be a woman. And there's no...
I was going to come on to next, so carry on. So that
there's no kind of link to how trans people and women actually live our lives. And so there's a fundamental disconnect here. So trans people, trans women particularly, are extremely scared about what could happen here. And I think part of it, we need to kind of go back and think about what happens to trans people when they start transition. So I'll frame it in this way. So when I got to a point where I had to do something, I actually spent quite a while trying to talk to medics and counsellors and so on. And then at some point, about 16, 17 years ago, I changed my name. I was actually seeing a gender specialist at the time. So I went to the gender specialist and he gave me a letter which I could send off with my name change document to the driving licence authority in the passport office. And I got back those pieces of identity documents with my new name and my new gender on them. I then lived as Helen from that point onwards. But it was a number of years before I decided that surgery was the thing I need. And actually the medic I was seeing said, I think you really ought to do this because you're mucking up your endocrine system with one of the things that you're taking. So
for a number of, so what's been, I know because there's this fear over or concern over women's spaces and there's talk about women's toilets.
If you're going to have a very simplistic law, which says that anybody with male genitals cannot go into the women's loos, the impact on trans people would then be, so how do you live fully as a woman,
Yeah.
which is your prerequisite to going in for genital surgery, should that be what you want. So it eliminates that whole thing, that whole route. So it effectively drives trans women underground completely, irrespective. And the second one actually is this. So there is that impact on trans women, but there's also an impact on every single woman and girl. Because if we're saying that access to women's spaces is policed only by what genitals you have, how are you going to inspect that and enforce it? You know, are you really going to ask people to undergo some kind of intimate examination before they can go to the loo? Or, you know, that's clearly extreme, but that's where you end up with this law. So if you don't want to do examination on demand, then you have to acquire a new form of documentation to say which genital configuration you currently have. And let's be brutally honest, people aren't concerned about access to men's spaces in those areas. So it'll be every woman and girl that has to acquire this, and they have to pay for it. So not only is it a kind of deeply offensive thing to try and do anyway, but there's an economic disadvantage to every single woman and girl in the country. And then what do you do for those women and girls who visit this country from overseas? How do they get one of these? What's the waiting list going to be? You know, the ramifications of this are huge, and all because of some manufactured fear of having men in women's spaces. All the statistics show that actually it's trans women who were more likely to be abused and more likely to be at danger in these spaces than other women.
Yeah.
So, you know, actually maybe what we should be saying is actually let's get the women out and let's get other women out and keep the women's spaces only for the people who are really in danger, which is the trans women. That's a bonkers argument. I'm not proposing that. But if you want to go on evidence, the evidence does not support this idea at all. And yet it's got traction because people are repeating it.
It really has got traction, hasn't it? And it's almost made the debate, it's become quite, very heated at times. And I know somebody had sent a message, saying, how do we take the hatred out of this debate? Because there's been a lot of, I've seen, I'm sure that you have seen and been subjected to it. And what do you think there is a way of doing this? Or
I think, there has been hate on both sides.
Yeah.
And I think, but you then have to look at who's going to lose out of this.
Yeah.
Because we have a situation at the moment where we police behaviour in these spaces. And so if you're going to move it onto a philosophical basis rather than the practical basis we've had for about 150 years, then what's your evidence for changing that base, that rule of law?
Yeah.
And that needs to be pretty solid, it appears to me, rather than just anecdote. So we have to get back to a point where we're looking at evidence. What do the statistics show us? And we also have to understand, rather than just making instant decisions on sound bites, what the implications are likely to be. And I know, because I've had it in a BBC studio, where those who are campaigning against trans people being in women's spaces say, well, there should be a third space for all trans people. And that's a segregational argument. Yeah. Now, we kind of are going through a thing with Black Lives Matter at the moment, where we've got a history for Black people with segregation, where we're trying to dismantle that.
Yeah.
So why should we want to try and impose it on another group of people where there are no problems? There's no substantial problems here. So I don't quite know how we take the heat out of it, because really only one side is being heard at the moment. So we need a much more factual discussion of these things, looking at the evidence, rather than manufactured, whipped up fear.
And I know in recent years, I mean, you've had quite access to senior politicians, haven't you? I mean, in government, who, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I felt that they were listening to you. Do you feel that is still the case?
No, it's not. I mean, certainly I think Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, I mean, I disagreed with Theresa on an awful lot, but she did understand some of this. And there was an aspect where government was receptive to the idea of promoting equality. How political am I allowed to be, David?
You're allowed to be political.
I will say that I think this government has shown that it has a loose connection to reality. Can I put it that way?
Yeah, you can.
And so it's not really capable of looking at the evidence. It's only looking at sound bites. It governs by sound bites. It tries to present things which put it in the best possible light. And I know that there are some trans people in the Conservative Party who are working extremely hard at the moment to try and make headway. But I don't get the impression that government ministers are willing to talk to trans people about something that affects trans people. And that ought to cause some massive alarm bells all over the place. I mean, one of the things, I don't particularly want any changes to the Equality Act to be tabled by this government, because Conservative MPs at the moment, I mean, you had, what was it, 2 months ago, last month, where they were all queuing up to vote in this massive queue. And you had Conservative MPs videoing themselves in the line saying how stupid this system was. This is completely impractical. What a ridiculous thing to do. And then going and voting for it anyway.
Yeah.
So my concern is that if something is tabled, they'll all moan about it and explain, in disgust how impractical it is, and then vote it through anyway. That's the risk. But on the other side, maybe it does need to be tabled so that we then have the media having to start to look at what the impact actually is. And I think when women understand what the impact is likely to be on them, because actually where things like this have been introduced, it was introduced in North Carolina in 2017, what started to happen was that any woman who didn't meet somebody else's perception of what it meant to look like or sound like a woman was being challenged.
Yeah.
And lesbians in this country have a history of being challenged in these spaces.
Yeah.
And they're not very happy about this either.
No.
So maybe it does need to be tabled, and then we can start to pull it to shreds and reveal it for the farrago of myths and fear that it actually is.
Yeah, but at the moment, it's quite a tough time. I take it at the moment. Yeah,
it has been it's been emotionally draining.
Yeah,
to be in a country where government doesn't want to listen. You don't have any voice in the media. You're constantly presented with stories about how terrible penises in women's spaces are. And there's no context to it. It's pure fear-mongering. And we're looking at lives being made virtually impossible for trans women should this happen. I mean, I was talking to my wife, and when we came down, we had a fantastic time when we came down in February last year. It was really good. Really sad I haven't been able to come down since, but hopefully soon. It hit her very hard because we were, I have been thinking, can I stay in this country?
I had, yeah.
And it hit my wife. I mean, I said that on Woman's Hour, BBC Woman's Hour, a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago. But it hit my wife about a week before that interview. Because I said, okay, how would you feel if every time I travelled into London, you weren't sure if I was going to come back because I might be arrested for using the ladies in Parliament? And that's what we are facing. That's what I'm having to deal with emotionally every day. And that is, so you can understand now, hopefully, why trans women, trans people are so scared, so angry about what might be unleashed on us in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah.
So expecting everybody who's trans to be able to debate entirely rationally in this particular situation, where they're faced with, actually, no, you can't do what you've been allowed to do perfectly legally for donkey's years, and there's no evidence actually that you're a risk to prevent you from doing this. You can understand why people are angry and scared. We've moved from a position where 3 years ago the Conservative government was saying we're going to make lives slightly easier for trans people in this way. And now they're saying, well, we're probably not, and we're going to make lives impractical for trans people. So
that's what I was seeing. I mean, that's what I've heard. And you have to be a bit sceptical. But as you say, Theresa May did, she brought in things like same-sex. It was under her as Home Secretary that same-sex marriage was brought in that. And so, although we have obviously we can have differences, but there were things that seemed to be going in the right direction. And just in the last, COVID has come along. I'll come on to that in a minute. But we've literally been sort of stopped we had the election and COVID. And now I'm looking at this and going, what's going on here? It doesn't seem to be going in the direction that we thought it might be. Challenging. Yeah.
It is difficult. I mean, I speak to a number of people, and every single trans person I know who has the money and the resources to, basically anybody who's employed is looking at leaving this country.
Really?
Yeah. And that is quite an indictment if you think about it.
That is, yeah. No, I'm hearing that too, but you're hearing it from trans people. Yeah, that is. We're leaving the European Union. We've left the European Union. What do you feel about the sort of, because we always looked at the EU was there as a sort of a safeguard in some ways. Many of our laws and changes that have been brought about and protection were brought about because, how they argue about this, but the EU was one of the sort of driving forces to make that happen, and also seemed to be there as a protection of our rights. And now that we're outside, does that concern you?
Well, there's 2 European courts which have voice in this area. One is the European Court of Justice. The other is the European Court of Human Rights.
Yeah.
It's the European Court of Justice, which is under the EU. So that's where people gain equality in employment and equality in service provision. What we're talking about here, I think, is more in terms of equality on its rawest level.
Yeah.
So we're looking there at the European Court of Human Rights. Now, I don't know. So leaving the European Union, in theory, has nothing to do with that. What leaving the European Union might do is start to water down some employment rights. And you've seen that Trump in the States has decided to remove all protections from LGBT people in terms of employment, and remove any protections against discrimination in providing healthcare for LGBT people.
Yeah.
Well, that would be hard to do, even if we're out of the EU, because human rights is still a concept in this country. And again, we have to have a rational conversation. What human rights do we not want? Maybe we want to kind of say, actually the right to not be a slave, maybe we should ditch that one. And what people don't understand is that these rights are actually very, very fundamental. You start mucking around with these at your peril. And let's not forget that the human rights, European Court of Human Rights, and the concept of human rights was developed by British lawyers after the Second World War. And one of the and what it was there to do was to protect individuals against powerful people or organizations. It was to protect individuals from the power of the state. Now, the other thing that we tend to do with human rights is we tend to think that we've got it all sorted and human rights are something we apply to others. And I think politically, that's where this government's head is. They're thinking, oh, we do human rights brilliantly, but we need to make sure these other countries do human rights the right way. Well, actually, we have a lot of inequalities here. And I talked about Black Lives Matter earlier.
Yeah.
That is an example where, strictly speaking, human rights legislation is already there, but the ability of people to take cases under that act, or the ability for organizations to kind of listen and amend their practices as a result of that, have been very limited, because you have a structural inequality which is built in, which is disadvantaging people, but they then can't do anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging times, obviously, at the moment, and especially with COVID. But what have you gained? Have you learned something good? What have you sort of taken away from this period?
Well, it's been, apart from learning what my natural hair colour is, you mean? Slightly greyer than I thought.
You sort of have mine. I got the trimmer out, and it sort of went a bit too much. But yeah,
I've got a week and a half. It's been difficult. I mean, I'm used to working from home, so from that respect, being at home wasn't that much of a problem, and I'm used, what it was basically doing what I generally do, but without the ability to go anywhere else to do it. And so you have this kind of psychological pressure of, oh gosh, I can't go out. So, and then from sort of late April on, we've had the whole trans thing, which has really dominated thinking. So trying to sort of put myself back into where I was at the end of April.
Right.
I think what I appreciate, I mean, we did have the most glorious spring.
Yeah.
Summer so far has not been quite so great, but spring was tremendous. And being able to sort of just take the time to look out the window or walk in the garden and just see, how things change day by day as sort of spring bursts out and new life emerges and the plants start growing really quickly. Being able to connect with nature in that way was quite nice and quite profound. But I wouldn't say I've learnt anything really big about that.
You'd recently moved down to Chippenham, is that right?
Well, I mean, I sort of had a base here since the 2017 election.
Right. Yeah.
So what we've done is we've moved the family home, which means we no longer have two homes. So the main family home is here.
No, well, look, I mean, it's been real delight chatting with you this afternoon. As always, last year for us, we're doing the Diversity Festival at the moment, but we actually had our first Pride parade in Barnstaple, the year before in Bideford. So we're hoping to sort of get back to be able to doing that next year. Maybe that'll be a good opportunity for you to come down and join us.
Well, I hope I can get down before then, but that would be kind. And I live in a little town called Corsham, right on the sort of northwestern edge of Wiltshire, and I'm a town councillor there. I mean, I know you're sort of the esteemed heights of Mr. Mayor now, which is great. But one of my first things which I've actually managed to do is get a pride flag, rainbow flag hanging from the town hall, which was quite simple.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, thank you. It's been really lovely chatting with you, and take care. And as I said, we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yeah, and thank you for the invite, David. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.